Okay, Content Strategy 101, the long-awaited presentation. First, I'd like to start with a metaphor. So I like to think of content like an iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is really, that's the final product. That's the content that people consume. When we think about content, this is often what people are thinking about. However, there's a whole lot of work that goes into developing good content, and that's content strategy. And that's all the work that goes into making sure that the right content, that the right people see the right content at the right time. The bulk of the content work is invisible to create good content. So to start off with just some scenarios, if these sound familiar, you know, have we ever had late content delay the launch of a website? Have we ever created page templates that look great but ultimately don't work when the real content goes in? Have we ever visited a site we redesigned a few years later and been like, what the heck happened here? Have we ever used lorem ipsum in designs because we don't have real content to work with? Have we ever had a bunch of opinions on content requirements come out of the woodwork at the 11th hour? I don't know about you all, but I have certainly encountered every one of these scenarios.
You pretty much summed up our jobs.
So taking a content-first approach to projects can really help to avoid a lot of these issues. And I do want to be clear here that this doesn't mean that all of the copy needs to be written for a website before we can design it. What it means is that at every step of the design process, from discovery through launch, we need to be thinking about content. So starting with some just basic definitions, what is content? I like to think of content pretty simply and broadly as just being helpful information. Content can take a whole lot of forms, you know, web pages, blog posts, videos, presentations, webinars, PDFs, print handouts, and so much more. Content strategy then is planning for the creation, publication, and governance of useful, usable content. This is kind of the industry accepted definition for content strategy at this point. It's still an emerging field, so there's new research coming out about this all the time, and new ideas. So it's a pretty exciting field to be getting into, and I think it's a good differentiator for us. Content strategy is made up of these 5 kind of essential components: the core strategy, which sits at the center of everything, and then there's content components and people components. The content components are substance and structure. The people components are workflow and governance. I will say that people often forget about the people components, and that is just so critical to figure out, because otherwise your strategy is just going to fall flat on its face and it's not going to go anywhere if there's no one championing it and if there's no one owning it. To go into a little more detail on these things, I like to think of the core strategy as like your strategy touchstone. This is the thing that you're always going to come back to in terms of the long-term direction that you're trying to achieve. It really defines how the organization is going to use content to achieve its objectives as well as meet user needs. So that's the foundational piece. And branching off, so the content components, substance is figuring out what content you need and why. This is thinking about like what topics you're going to write about, what format should your content be in. You know, are videos better received by your audience? Are audio files better received by your audience? Are words better received by your audience? Sources of content, are you going to be creating this content? Are you going to be curating content from other sources, and other stuff like that? Substance also is about what messages content needs to communicate to your audience, which is getting at message architecture, and I'll go into a little more detail on that later. Structure is thinking about how your content needs to be prioritized, organized, formatted, and displayed. So this is the information architecture, sitemaps, metadata, wireframes, linking strategies, stuff like that about how content is structured. Then moving over to the people component side of the circle, workflow is figuring out what processes, tools, and human resources are going to be needed for content to launch successfully and be maintained, and maintain that quality. Governance is how key decisions about content and content strategy are made, and how those changes are initiated and communicated. So it's a lot about ownership and policies. At the end of the day, content strategy is really all about communication. So as part of content strategy, you know, put your content strategy hat on. You're trying to answer these fundamental questions. Who are we talking to? What do we talk to them about? How do we talk about it? Where do we talk about it? And why are we talking about this in the first place? Hopefully you guys see some overlap here between what we're already doing, especially in terms of user experience and our branding offering. Their content strategy sits kind of in the middle of those two things. So how do you do content strategy? It often starts with a content audit. Content audit is really a reality check. You know, it's an honest look at what you have and where you're at today. There's different types of audits, and you'll choose different types of audits depending on, you know, the current stage of the project, what you're looking at, what the pain point is that you're trying to solve, et cetera, et cetera. So quantitative audits are really numbers based. You know, you're looking at amounts. You're looking at what do you have and how much. It's very specific, and it's very measurable. Qualitative audits are where it gets a little more in depth, and it's evaluating, is what you have any good? So it's taking it to the next level, and really looking at quality. And then a more advanced qualitative audit starts to take into account competitor content, and figuring out what content you don't have. And so making plans for where future content could better meet your user needs. Some things that you evaluate as part of a content audit include all of the things you see here. It's gonna, you know, it really depends on the type of audit that you're conducting and the goals in terms of what data you're gonna wanna collect. A lot of these things, and in the columns as you go from left to right, it's kind of very, very specific, getting more qualitative as you go across. So typically it's easier to start with the qualitative audit, like the how much and the what you have, and progressively get more advanced as you go. Doing an audit really is, it's spreadsheet hell. Like I'm not gonna lie, it's really tedious and time consuming, but I promise it is worth doing every time. You will always learn something. And as we all believe in, as part of purpose-driven design, you can't guess your way to credibility unless you understand what you're currently working with. You're not gonna have a great foundation on which to make future recommendations. So once you've gathered all of your data in a spreadsheet or multiple spreadsheets, it's time to really crunch numbers, do some math, set up some formulas, calculate some stuff, you know, mix and match based on different criteria. Just look at your content through a bunch of different lenses in a bunch of different ways, and try to find interesting patterns. Something always jumps out, and sometimes it's surprising, sometimes it's expected. Either way, it helps to either validate hypotheses that you already have, or you learn new things that you just didn't even know existed. Specifics in terms of analysis is going to vary depending on what your audit doing, because the goals are going to be different. So you're going to, you know, it really depends on what your client is trying to achieve and trying to understand about their content. This step is so important as the foundation for content strategy work, because it gives you with all the hard numbers and rationale to back every one of your strategic recommendations. So similar to how we use a creative direction coming out of a discovery effort to kind of set the tone for how we're going to design the site and what principles we're going to be looking at. That's what this data helps us do for content strategy. So once you have all the analysis done, you synthesize those findings into a digestible format. I typically go with a deck, you know, putting together visuals, graphics, because people only have so much tolerance for looking at a data-heavy spreadsheet. So you got to make it a little visual. And then you use all those synthesized findings to create a strategy. So this is really the fun part, and where you get to be a little visionary and get out of where you currently are and really picture the future. So strategy is an aligned vision of where you're going. It's a clear common objective for the team. So the components that make up this core strategy piece are a core strategy statement, content components, which can include message architecture, voice and tone guidelines, and a topic strategy, and then people components, so about workflow and governance. I'll go into, I'm not going to be able to get into each one of these things, but I'll give you guys examples now of the core strategy statement, the message architecture, and workflow, which are really critical foundational pieces of every content strategy. So when you're developing a core strategy statement, it's good to keep these criteria in mind. So a good core strategy statement is flexible. It can accommodate various tactics and teams. It doesn't shoehorn you into one specific type of content or one specific type of person that can produce that content. It's aspirational. It's a stretch. It's focused on where you ideally want to be. It's not about where you're at today and what you're currently doing. It's memorable. It's easily understood and used constantly. For a core strategy statement to be effective, it needs to be used. So it's really important to make that the client understands what it is and everyone has buy-in. It's motivational. It's worthwhile. It gets people jazzed and excited. And it's inclusive. It leaves room for a wide variety of contributions. It's not just limited to what the marketing team can do. It really is opened up for anybody to contribute and help meet the core goal. So here's an example of a core strategy statement. This is a slightly altered version of one we presented recently for a client. So it can be, this is an annotated sentence format, and I found this to be very effective. And I got this format from Christina Halverson's Content Strategy for the Web. And it's really nice because it's so bite-sized. It's very easily digestible. And when I present this in a real life scenario, to a client, I would stage out each of these annotations one by one. So we really talk through the entire statement, and every piece of this has meaning. Moving on to message architecture. So first, defining it. What is a message architecture? It defines the organization's primary communication goals. These are things that you want your users to remember about you. That's how I like to think of message architecture. And message architecture is important because it drives a consistent user experience, both visually and verbally. And I just love this illustration. I think it so clearly demonstrates the importance of having a consistent hierarchy of communication goals. Without having this in place, you're going to have a bunch of siloed departments putting out each their own individual messages for their individual audiences. And you're going to be able to tell that the organization's website's content does not gel. It's when you jump from one section to the other, it's going to feel very different. To make things more cohesive, message architecture really helps to do that. And then you can tailor your messages for each of your audience, but they're all getting the same core message. Here's an example of a message architecture. This is going with the format of you have one primary message and then a series of prioritized secondary messages. This is taking a sentence format to describing the message architecture because that's what worked for the specific client in this case. Sometimes you can, it's enough for the team to work with to just do a series of prioritized adjectives, authoritative, trustworthy, credible, whatever those key things are. The most important thing is that it resonates with the internal team who's going to be working with this and using this. None of this language, you'll never see this appear in actual content on a website. It's really to drive internal decision-making and prioritization. Then finally, looking at the people components, so workflow and governance. This is really about defining the process, designating clear ownership, and making sure everybody knows the rules so that everyone can play by the rules. This whole piece of content strategy is really an effort to remove subjectivity from the approval process. If everybody's aligned on who owns what, on what the common goals are, and how we get there, it makes it a lot easier for content to get approved because everyone's working from the same set of goals. So here's an example of a documented workflow that we recently did for a client. And this is something that Karen helped me put together. I just had a massive Google Doc listing out this whole process, and Karen transformed it into an amazingly helpful flowchart describing and making it visual and visible how involved it is to get a piece of content from idea to actually published on the site. So as part of this presentation, what we did was document their existing workflow, and then the strategy piece of it was identifying areas where there were inefficiencies and that we needed to improve. there was more to this document as well. It was a very long flow chart. And I think this was tremendously helpful for the content, just to make, or for the editorial team, just to make it clear how much work goes into it, because so many people still have this misconception that writing content involves a few hours. You just write an article, but there's actually a whole lot of work and thought that needs to go into it. The final step is to make an action plan. So this is how you get from where you are to where you're going. These are the concrete steps you can take to move forward. So this again comes after you do your audit and get your findings. That's your where you are. Then you come up with your strategy, where you're going, and here's the plan on how to get there. So every content strategy should include an action plan with specific tactics and recommendations. Some things you might include are what user needs the client should prioritize, what actions the client should prioritize. I like to think of this on like an effort impact kind of matrix, and try to target low effort, high impact items first. Identify what content to remove or discontinue. Identify what new on-strategy content the client should be creating and in what formats. And suggesting what distribution channels to explore or discontinue based on what you know about the audience needs. This is, there could be a whole bunch of other things that you include in an action plan depending on the specific needs of the client and where they're at and what their resourcing is. But these are often areas that I hit on as part of any strategic recommendations. It's also really important to include specific ways to measure success as part of a content strategy so that you can evaluate whether or not it's working. So I've recently started looking into setting, and been trying to do this in practice, setting SMART goals. So those are goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. So really getting granular with the goal setting so that it's easier to measure, because just increasing traffic to the website is too vague, it's too broad, it's too hard to measure. It's more effective to get granular. So an example of a SMART goal, which is an alteration of something I've used recently, is to publish 3 new pieces of content a month in order to increase unique page views on a website by 10% by the end of 2019. So this is very specific. It's measurable in 2 ways, by the number of pieces of content as well as the amount that you're trying to increase page views by. It's achievable, it's within the client's resourcing that it's achievable. It's relevant to the client's goals, which is to increase traffic to the website. And it's time-based, by the end of 2019 is when the goal is set. So how do you package this all up? A typical content strategy package includes these 3 elements, but there's a lot more that could go into it. But first, the content strategy deck. So that contains the audit findings, your core strategy, and your specific action item recommendations. I've got some examples here that we could either look at later, or you can look at in your own free time, and I'm happy to walk you guys through any of these examples if you're curious about it. Content audit data, so all of the raw data that was collected. Typically when we're doing an audit analysis, we look at the most important stuff, but there's no way that we can analyze everything. And that content audit data document is really valuable, and it's meant to be used and referred to on an ongoing basis. So that's a very important, valuable deliverable to hand over to the client. And then finally, message architecture, often which is accompanied by voice and tone guidelines, is something that we include as part of our typical package. However, content, any one of these deliverables that you see here could be produced under a content strategy umbrella. So it really depends on the project that you're working on and the goals of the project and what's going to be most helpful for the client, and I've done a lot of these things in the past. Content style guides, content templates is something we've used a lot more recently. Metadata recommendations, personas, there's a lot of different angles to come at it from. A little bit about what kind of clients could benefit from content strategy. These are some signs I think it makes sense to keep an eye out for. Clients who don't know how much or what types of content they have, that's a big red flag that they could probably use some content strategy assistance. Clients who have a really content heavy site, so a sprawling site with thousands of pages or content spread out over multiple sites, it's Especially if those sites don't have any documented content strategy, they could likely use some help there, and specifically starting with an audit in those cases. Clients who have already identified content as an issue or have gotten burned by content issues on past website projects are great candidates for content strategy. Clients who do not have a plan for who's going to rewrite content as part of a site redesign effort. If there's not a plan for who's going to write it, it's a good sign they probably don't understand how much work that's going to involve, which means they could probably use content strategy. Clients who don't have a person who is responsible for overall content quality. It's amazing how often you still run into this. There's no person actually in charge of the content, which is how it gets, it deteriorates over time. Clients who want to rank higher in search results. I think that people who are after kind of quick wins and improvement in SEO, it's often an indicator that there's a deeper underlying need to evaluate the purpose of their content. And then clients who are unable to articulate their mission, brand values, or user goals. If clients don't have a ready answer to what their users need, it's a really good sign that they probably are not operating with a good content strategy. Some other things that are important to know about content strategy. Content strategy is scalable. It can be broad or narrow. We can have big budgets, little budgets. It really depends on the specific need, and we can scale it up and down as needed, dependent on budget constraints, resourcing constraints, etc. Content strategy is really flexible. We can do content strategy for product design. We can do content strategy for website design. We can really tailor it to fit our needs. Content strategy is actionable. It's not something that's meant to be delivered and then just sit in a Google Drive. Content strategy is meant to be used every day on an ongoing basis once it's been developed to help make decisions going forward and to help make your content, maintain your content. But honestly, content strategy can be useful at any point in a project. You know, I think it relates to a lot of the work that we're already doing, and we're already considering a lot of these things. I just wanted to call out a few specifics. I think content strategy relates to SEO work because keyword research helps us uncover user intent and helps us better understand user needs, which then helps us better deliver that content to them. Brand work, content strategy helps take those brand values that and art direction that we define at the beginning of a project and really make it actionable through developing a message architecture. UX work, content strategy thinking, helps to better inform wireframe, sitemaps, and user flows. For visual design work, having those prioritized communication goals in the form of a message architecture really does inform visual design choices and hierarchies and what you decide to do. Development work, you know, content strategy should inform CMS requirements. What are the most important things that the people in and out of the CMS need to know in order to be able to reliably and consistently produce good content? And then production work, you know, thinking about content strategy in the estimation and project management phase of a project will give us more accurate timelines and budgets, and we can better manage risk if we understand how much complexity is involved in the content. A few ideas for leveling up on content strategy. Something that I've been thinking about and working on more explicitly this year is how to more effectively include the people parts of the content strategy puzzle. So really going a little more heavy-handed on workflow and governance. You know, and historically, I've focused primarily on the substance and structure pieces of the content puzzle. But finding that this workflow and governance piece is really critical for actually getting content strategy to last and to actually be upheld and to work. So definitely interested in digging more into that this year. Integrating our brand and content strategy offering more seamlessly. This is something Reed and I have chatted about a few times, and I'm excited to keep that conversation going because I do think that these things are so closely related, and tying content strategy to brand can help make the branding work that we do more tangible in a way. So I'm excited to start making that a more seamless offering. Incorporating messaging testing into our process. This is something that came up in the design meeting recently. Is just, you know, a quick test that we could do on a new redesign for messaging is to test the homepage and find out, do people understand what we offer? So I think there's quick wins we could do to find out if the message is coming through as intended. And then always figuring out way to measure results specifically related to content strategy so that we can prove its effectiveness and actually evaluate progress over time. Here's a bunch of my favorite resources. I have so many books on content strategy. What's not included here is the Content Strategy Podcast, which is another fantastic resource I've been using a lot, as well as Gather Content and Contently. Both of those companies offer like content management software, but they produce an incredibly amount of helpful content. And then lastly, I just want to end on this quote that I love and I constantly want to remember, is that most people aren't coming to a website and going, look, wow, this design is awesome. Like, look at this information architecture and what great UX. Those are only people like us who do that. Most people in the world are coming to a site for the content. At the end of the day, they're really there to get the information they need at the time they need it. And it's supposed to help them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome.